Hello, and thank you for joining us here at SentencingStats.com. I am Mark Allenbaugh, co-founder, and today I have with me Dr. Cary Elliot, one of our economists, and we will be discussing the Paul Manafort sentencing today. He received 90 months in front of Judge Jackson, Amy Berman Jackson, in the District of Columbia. And just to remind everybody, Mr. Manafort pled guilty pursuant to a plea agreement to 2 counts of conspiracy, 1 count of conspiracy to launder money, the other to obstruct justice, for a maximum penalty of 10 years or 120 months. Last week, he was sentenced to 47 months for related conduct in front of Judge Ellis of the Eastern District of Virginia. His calculations, as far as I understand them, is the guidelines calculations in this case, in the DC case, came up to a whopping 40 in criminal history category 2 because of his prior conviction being the one last week. The guidelines, as it turns out, are rather irrelevant in this case because they exceed the statutory maximum of 120 months. And as you can see, the guidelines were calling for quite a significant sentence. So what we're going to discuss is statistically, where does his 90-month sentence come out? But just quickly before we get into that, what you're seeing here in front of you is a comparison of the average and median sentences by certain offense categories to what his guideline range was in the Eastern District of Virginia. And of course, his guideline range, as we just saw in DC, was technically higher, although it's capped by the statutory maximum of 120 months. One of the things that Judge Ellis said last week when he was imposing sentence that shocked everybody because Manafort only received 47 months is he said that, look, the guidelines were kind of out of whack. Actually, he said they were out of whack and vindictive. And he has a point, statistically speaking, when we look at other offense types and what the average and median sentences are there. This yellow bar here in the middle, what this represents is the sentencing range that the guidelines called for last week, which was 235 months, just a hair under 20 years, to 293 months. And you can see it was basically what somebody convicted of producing child pornography would receive, and almost what somebody convicted of under the first-degree murder guidelines would receive, more than for kidnapping. And here is what the typical offender would receive for in a fraud case or in a money laundering case, which is really if you had to classify as offense conduct, it really fell under kind of money laundering. Of course, it involved tens of millions of dollars, so that's part of the reason what drove the guidelines up so high. But this high seems a little bit ridiculous, as Judge Ellis recognized. At any rate, without further ado, I'm going to hand this over now to Dr. Elliot so he can speak to more specific findings with respect to this 90-month sentence that Mr. Manafort received today. So, Dr. Elliot, perhaps you could speak to what we're looking at here.
Sure, absolutely. Before we jump into this specific table, let's talk a little bit about the data that we're looking at. And the data that we use comes from the United States Sentencing Commission. The commission provides annual data files for all sentencing events in federal courts. We focus, as you saw in the previous slide that Mark was looking at, we focus on time period 2006 to 2017, when we show those statistics. And that corresponds to the time when the sentencing guidelines became advisory. Since 2006, judges are now free to deviate from the prescribed sentencing ranges. So we go up to 2017. 2018 data will be coming out fairly soon. And the data contains just about any information you want to know about a sentence. We'll be using a few of the characteristics in the data, including obviously the number of months sentenced, the main statute under which the offender was sentenced, applicable guideline ranges, whether or not there were statutory minimum and maximum, and whether the defendant cooperated with the government. So let's look at let's go to the next slide, Mark. Thanks. So here we have what we call box and whiskers graph, and it basically shows, so that the very top whisker there, if we look at that 75 months, these are months on the y-axis, and that is essentially the largest sentence that we see for this specific statute. And that statute there is 2B1.1, which is fraud. I'm not sure if we can see the x-axis there, Mark, but that's 2B1.1.
Yeah, 2B1.1.
And the lowest sentences we see are 0 months. Now that just keep in mind that just for graphical reasons, there can be a few very high sentences that we leave out of here. So basically the data generally, what you're seeing is 99% of the sentences, and any very large outliers are left out just for graphical purposes here.
And by that, Dr. Elliot, what you mean is that there are sentences, in fact, above 75 months, but that the bulk, 99% of all sentences imposed are below the 75-month range? That's
correct.
Okay.
Generally speaking, yeah.
And what are these numbers down here?
Yeah, those numbers down there. So the top of the box there is called the 75th percentile. Mm-hmm. So 75% of the sentences are 30 months or lower. And then the bottom of the box, well over a quarter of sentences are 0. Yeah, for the next. That is 2S1.1 that Mark's pointing out there, and 25% of the sentences are 17 or lower. So the median sentence, if we stick with 2S1.1, which is actually the main statute under which Mr. Manafort was sentenced today, the median is 42 months. So that means about half of the sentences falls below 42. Mm-hmm. The average sentence is 69 months. Yeah. Okay. And what the box and whiskers does is it gives you a lot more information than if we just told you what the average sentence is. So you can kind of see where you fall in the distribution of sentences, and it's just it's just an easy to understand, at least for me, easy to understand graphical display of the data. So Mr. Manafort's sentence of effective sentence of 90 months is shown there in the red dotted line. And we can see that it is really above what we would have expected for any of these statutes under which any of these crimes that he has been convicted of.
Right. I think you mean any of the guidelines as opposed to statutes. Yeah.
Yes, guidelines.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Right.
So
it's would you say this was a pretty, looking at this statistically then, 90 months was on the high side, whether you were comparing everybody that was sentenced under 2B1.1 or everybody that was sentenced under 2S1.1 or 2S1.3, which was his guideline last week. And just for comparative purposes, here's tax, because he had some tax offenses in there. So is that a fair inference to make from these data distributions? That 90 months is on the high side?
That's exactly right. I mean, particularly if you're looking at fraud, the 2S1.3 there and the tax, it would be well above what we would expect. It would be an outlier.
Right. It would be and can you explain what an outlier is?
Well, kind of different definitions of an outlier, but it's something outside of range that we would statistically expect, that with any reasonable probability we would expect to see that data. So for instance, I said the top of the whisker there, like the 75%,
Yeah.
99% of the data are below that. So we wouldn't expect.
So 99% of these 95,558 individuals sentenced under 2B1.1, 99% of them, or close to 99% of them, received a sentence of 75 months or less. So therefore, a sentence of 90 months would be considered an anomaly?
That's correct. That's correct. So, strictly speaking, this is the range that we've seen in the past, right? No more than 75 months sentence for fraud. Yeah. So, in respect to fraud, this would be outside of what we would expect. Yes.
Right. But these distributions, though, contain, this is everybody sentenced under these particular guidelines, regardless of final offense level or criminal history category, correct?
We're not. There are a lot of dimensions to these crimes that are not being controlled for here. That's correct.
Okay.
So if we wanted to move on to the next one, we have selected a group of cases that we feel are similarly situated to this Manafort case. Mm-hmm. Specifically, these are 2S1.1s.
Right.
These are money laundering.
Right.
And they faced a statutory maximum of 120 months.
Right.
No mandatory minimums.
Right.
And now maybe you can.
Right.
Maybe. Yeah.
Right. So these are not just similarly situated, but I would argue that they were identically situated because here again, as you pointed out, they were sentenced under 2S1.1, statutory maximum of 120 months, which is what Manafort looked at. We saw that earlier. But his guidelines, the guidelines were 120 months also. And what that means was, as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, his guidelines were above the statutory maximum. And as we know, when that happens, the statutory maximum becomes the guidelines. And so we looked at all the individuals that not only had a stat max of 120 months, but their guidelines were also 120 months, meaning that their guidelines actually were above 120 months and they had to be readjusted to the statutory maximum. And then as you just pointed out, there was no mandatory minimum involved. And also we filtered out anybody that received a 5K downward departure for substantial assistance, because that would unfairly skew the data.
Now, could you explain that one? So in the Manafort case, he did not get any downward departures, because my understanding is that there was some. This is a part of a plea deal, correct?
Right. And you're exactly right. It was part of a plea deal. He tried to get a 5K for substantial assistance, but he was found by the court, by Judge Jackson a few weeks ago, to have violated his plea agreement, and therefore the government stated and the court allowed them not to file a 5K. Nor was he given any credit for acceptance of responsibility, as far as I understand it. That's a different matter. So as far as the 5K is concerned, he did not get a 5K. He tried for it and messed up, and so the government withdrew its 5K offer, which could have resulted in a much lower sentence than what he received. But at any rate, so can you explain what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so we're looking at here, of course. these are all where the statutory maximum, has trumped the guidelines.
Right.
So at the top here, we have a large number of people who are receive the maximum 120. So that is the maximum sentence that we see. And now we look down to the 25% of the sentences were at 84 months or less. And so Mr. Manafort is coming in just above that. And
this is the 90 months here in the red.
That's the 90 months right there in the red. So it's within the range in which we would expect. So, the box basically represents the middle half of the data, right? So the sentence falls in the middle half of what actually, in this case, it's 75% of the people receive above an 84. So but still, he's just above the 25th percentile. He's at like the 26th or 27th percentile here.
Okay.
So it's still a little relatively low of a sentence, but certainly not outside the norm at all in any way, shape, or form.
And isn't this called the interquartile spread?
It is generally, but here we're looking at it's going from 25% right up to 100 because we're bounded at the 120.
Got it. I understand. Okay. Good. Okay. So what is the inference then that we can draw from this? I mean, when we looked at this, we said, 90 months is on the high side, and it could be considered an anomaly under some comparisons. But here we're saying that it's within the range of what identically situated offenders typically receive?
Yes, I mean, it's controlling for the actual characteristics of the case and looking at the history of sentences. So, if we can find similar situated cases, or you believe, you would argue that these are identically situated, but that's the difference between an attorney and an economist or statistician. I can't make that call. But yeah, certainly, if we're able to control for the various factors that go into the judge's decision outside of just what the guidelines are mechanically calling for, this is the kind of data that you would look at. You would, yeah.
Okay. So, and then finally, here, with 90 months, and we'll just go through this quickly. What we've pulled up here is his life expectancy. And you and I, before we started the presentation, did a quick back of the napkin calculation. And it looks like that even with good conduct credit and his credit for his pre-sentencing detention, he's been sitting in the Alexandria jail for the last 9 months waiting detention, that he still has at least another 5 years to serve, even considering all of these other reductions. So we know that his life expectancy is about 85.4 years. I did this last month on February 16th. We also know that he's going to turn 70 on April 1, so just in a couple of weeks. So there's his life expectancy. And then you and I had discussed this rather recent study about 6 years ago by Dr. Patterson. And she had found that there's, for long-term custody, every year an inmate spends in custody can reduce or tends to reduce his life expectancy by 2 years over here. And you and I aren't defending or vouching for this. This is just one study, one recent study that we found. Although I will note that this particular study has been cited with approval by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. where they cited this in reversing a within guidelines case just a few years ago. At any rate, so using this, we just, or I put together a very simple graph here showing his Manafort's life expectancy. It's right now, we say it was 85.4 years here in 2019. And so every year thereafter, it's going to reduce by 2 years. Here's his age. He's 69.8, at least when I created this graph, he was. We now know he's almost 70, but he's going to increase in age every year, by 1 year. And so based upon the Patterson study, we expect that he will, statistically speaking, die in prison if he is not released from custody before 2024. So that's within the next 5 years. So in effect, at least what attorneys could argue with this study is that a 90-month sentence is a de facto life sentence for him. Anything you care to add, Dr. Elliot?
I think this is definitely a fine analysis. There are, I would question the applicability of this specific study. And we talked about that before, and it was a very interesting conversation because, the study was based on prisoners in New York State. And my understanding or my priors was that, Mr. Manafort may in fact be going into a situation that's probably a little less harsh than those conditions in New York State jails and for the type of crime that he's committed. But but on the other hand, he's demonstrably in ill health right now, entering prison. So I think this is a good representation of the situation that we're facing right now.
Right. And as we also noted too, as we also discussed, is when he goes in to federal prison, even if he goes to a camp, he might still end up in segregation because of his notoriety. And that's what I understand that he's been in at the Alexandria City Jail. He's been in their the equivalent of a special housing unit there for the last 9 months because, well, he's a target, again, considering who he is. But be that as it may,
detrimental effect on your health.
Correct. Well, be that as it may, I would think that at the very least, with 5 years to go, it's going to take up, if not the rest of his entire life, the bulk of it. So he's not going to have much of a life left, if he survives this term in prison, at any rate. So at least in bulk, or at the end, my analysis would be he got a sufficiently just sentence, both statistically speaking from the statistics that we reviewed, as well as based upon his life expectancy and age, and this despite the outcry that he got a slap on the wrist. He's going to end up, whether he got a sentence for 90 months or 90 years, the end result may be the same, a de facto life sentence. Well, that's going to end it for us today. Thank you for joining us here at Sentencing Stats, and thank you, Dr. Elliot, for your contribution. We will have some follow-up videos from time to time on other high-profile sentencings. Thank you for your time. I'm Mark.
Okay, great.
Okay, thank you.